All right, so Genesis 50:20 today. Probably a verse, as well as, your own sermon notes. But we're going to do a deep dive today and go a little bit beyond the Sunday school answers, and try to give those pastors and Bible study leaders listening something that they can really use.
Yeah, it's really easy to oversimplify this verse, right? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. But these sermons really get into it.
Yeah, it's not just a feel-good story about forgiveness, right?
hmm
There's a lot more going on here.
Oh, yeah, a lot more. It's about divine providence. It's about God's sovereignty.
So how did these pastors approach it? I mean, like, what were some of the unique things?
Well, one that really struck me was this sermon that used the metaphor of the pit to talk about Joseph's suffering.
Okay.
And, it wasn't just about like what he went through, but it was about the transformation that happened, while he was in the pit.
Okay. Unpack that a little more for me. How does that work?
Well, think about it, right? His brothers threw him in this pit. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to harm him.
Right.
And yet that pit became the place where he had to confront his fears, his weaknesses.
It's like a crucible almost.
Exactly. And the sermon argued that, we all have our pits in life, these experiences that feel isolating, painful, even unjust.
Right.
And it's often in those pits that God is doing his deepest work in us.
So how did the pastor apply that to the congregation then?
Well, he challenged them to ask, what is my pit? What is God doing in me through this experience? It's a really powerful way to shift the focus, from just enduring hardship to actually seeing the potential for growth.
Right. So you're not denying the pain or minimizing the evil, but you're recognizing God can use even those dark places.
Exactly. And it all ties back to that but God moment in Genesis 50:20. That's a phrase that a lot of these sermons really dug into.
It's almost like a hinge in the story, right?
Yeah.
Like everything changes at that point.
One pastor described it as like a sudden unveiling of a grander plan, The brothers, they were operating on a purely human level. They were driven by jealousy and fear. And then God steps in, and suddenly their evil act becomes part of this much larger redemptive narrative.
Almost like God saying, hey, I'm writing this story, not you.
Yeah, exactly. And another sermon really highlighted that challenge of trusting in God's providence, especially when we can't see the full picture.
Yeah.
Why would a loving God allow suffering in the first place?
I mean, that's the question I think everybody asks at some point, right?
Right. And this pastor didn't offer easy answers. He acknowledged the tension, the mystery, even the anger that we might feel towards God when bad things happen.
So how did he approach it then?
Well, he used this analogy of a tapestry. You know how we only see the backside, the tangled threads, the seemingly random knots, but
Right.
God sees the front, the beautiful design, the intricate pattern that he's weaving together.
It's a limited perspective. Right?
Exactly. Our perspective is limited. We don't always see the full scope of God's plan, but we can trust that he's working all things together for good.
And that trust isn't passive, though.
Yeah. No, this pastor emphasized that we have to actively seek God's purpose in our suffering, even when it's hard.
Yeah, that's good. It's not about, pretending everything's okay. It's about believing that God is present in the pain and he's using it for something.
Exactly. And another aspect that a lot of sermons explored was that connection between Joseph and Jesus.
Yeah, like foreshadowing.
Right,
Yeah.
It's not just a coincidence. It points to a deeper truth about God's redemptive plan throughout history.
Right.
One pastor drew this really interesting parallel between Joseph being sold into slavery and Jesus being betrayed for silver.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he highlighted how both of them were unjustly accused, rejected by their own people. And ultimately, their suffering became the means of salvation for others.
So almost like setting up this theme of, what is meant for evil, God uses for good.
Exactly. And that connection can be really powerful for sermons. It elevates Joseph's story from just this personal triumph to this cosmic drama of redemption,
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about kind of the deeper theological things, but let's get a little practical here. What about sermon illustrations? Did these pastors use any that were memorable that brought Genesis 50:20 to life?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One pastor used a story about Claire Colwell. She's a pro-life speaker who survived an abortion attempt.
Wow.
And he connected her story to Genesis 50:20, showing how God's providence and redemption can work even in those really difficult circumstances.
So he's taking this modern example and tying it back to the ancient text.
Exactly. And he did it with incredible sensitivity, too.
Yeah.
Honoring Claire's story while also drawing out these universal themes of forgiveness, redemption, and God's grace.
It's good. I like hearing these practical examples.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that those stories are all around us. you know?
Mhm.
We just need to be looking for them. We need to listen for echoes of God's grace in the lives of those we encounter.
Speaking of echoes, I'm curious about cross-referencing. Did these pastors use any unexpected cross-references? Did they go beyond Romans 8:28?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Romans 8:28 came up quite a bit.
Of course.
But there are some really surprising connections as well.
Okay, I like surprises.
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, one pastor went all the way back to Genesis 12, the covenant God made with Abraham,
Okay.
and he pointed out how Joseph saving those lives during the famine actually fulfilled part of that original promise,
Oh, wow.
demonstrating God's faithfulness across generations.
So he's taking this small story
Yeah,
and he's fitting it into this much larger narrative of salvation.
exactly. And another pastor used Colossians 1 to illustrate God's sovereignty over creation, connecting it to the very foundation of the universe, you know?
So it's not just a human story. It's a much bigger story than that.
Exactly. And it challenges us to look beyond just our immediate circumstances and trust in God's ultimate purpose, even when we can't fully grasp it.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so another thing that I saw in some of these sermons is pastors using personal stories.
Oh, yeah.
And that always feels a little risky to me.
Yeah.
Like, is that appropriate? What did you see?
Yeah, well, one pastor shared a really powerful story about his wife's medical struggles. And he talked about this really profound encounter that they had with a nurse in the emergency room. And the nurse shared a story that unexpectedly connected to their situation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it became this really beautiful illustration of God's providence in the most unexpected places.
So he took something really personal and painful and he turned it into this message of hope.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most impactful illustrations come from our own lives, the raw and messy experiences that have shaped our faith.
Right. So it's about being willing to be vulnerable, to share our own pit moments, so to speak.
Exactly. And to show how God has met us in those dark places. Because ultimately, that's what makes our preaching relatable and authentic.
Right. It's not about pretending to have all the answers. It's about sharing our journey.
Exactly. The doubts, the struggles, the moments of unexpected grace.
So for those pastors and Bible study leaders listening who are maybe feeling a little stuck in a rut with this verse, what's the biggest takeaway, you think?
I think the most important takeaway is to just embrace the complexity of Genesis 50:20. Don't shy away from the hard questions, Explore the theological depths.
Yeah.
Allow yourself to be challenged by the paradox of God using evil for good.
Right. Because it's not just a feel-good platitude.
Yeah.
It's a statement about who God is.
Exactly. And remember the power of storytelling, These sermons were full of captivating illustrations, personal anecdotes, even pop culture references.
It's good to mix it up, right?
Keep things fresh and engaging, especially when we're dealing with familiar passages like this one.
Right, because ultimately we want to see lives transformed, right?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
goal isn't just to inform, but to transform. It's that surrender that's so hard, isn't it? Giving up control. But these sermons really get into that. One pastor talked about wrestling with the but God moment in a really personal way.
Oh, really? How so?
He talked about this time when he felt like everything was falling apart in his life. He had put his heart and soul into this ministry project and it just totally flopped. And he was devastated. He was questioning his calling. He wondered if he had even heard God's voice correctly in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, as a pastor, that's got to be a tough place to be.
Absolutely. And he said, at that point, the but God of Genesis 50:20, it felt like a cruel joke more than a promise.
Right.
But as he wrestled with those feelings, he said God started to show him a different perspective. God showed him that sometimes what we see as failure is actually a redirection, a pruning, a necessary step in our journey towards becoming who God has created us to be.
So he's taking this experience of failure and he's connecting it back to that idea of God's providence in Genesis 50:20.
Exactly. And he challenged his congregation to consider their own failures and to ask, could this be a but God moment in disguise? Is God using this seemingly negative experience to redirect my path, to refine my character, to maybe even open a new door that I hadn't even considered?
Right. So it's about shifting our perspective on what success and failure actually look like.
Exactly. Because our definition of success and failure is often very different from God's.
Right. It frees us up from having to get everything right.
Exactly. And it allows us to kind of embrace the messiness of the journey,
Right.
knowing that God is working even in the midst of our setbacks.
Speaking of messy journeys, I remember one pastor used a really unique analogy. He talked about making kimchi.
Kimchi. Okay, I've got to hear this one.
So he talked about how kimchi is made by fermenting cabbage, which is basically controlled rotting.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of gross when you think about it, but the end result is something delicious and nutritious.
Okay, I think I see where he's going with this.
So he was drawing a parallel between that fermentation process and the way God can use our difficult experiences, our pit experiences, to transform us into something new and beautiful.
So like the cabbage has to go through this kind of messy process to become kimchi. We have to go through hard things sometimes to become who God wants us to be.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And he said, just like the cabbage has to go through that fermentation process to become kimchi, we often have to go through those difficult experiences to become the people God has created us to be.
It's a good analogy because it reminds us that transformation is not always comfortable or pretty.
No.
Yeah.
It can be really messy.
Yeah. But the end result is worth it.
And it's a reminder that God is present in that mess. He's orchestrating the process. He's making sure that the end result is something good.
Another thing that struck me about these sermons was how they emphasized the community aspect of Genesis 50:20. It's not just about Joseph's individual journey. It's about reconciliation.
Right.
It's about restoring broken relationships.
Joseph could have easily held on to bitterness and resentment towards his brothers.
Oh, absolutely. But he chooses to forgive them. He
Yeah.
chooses to embrace them and to reconcile with them.
Yeah. It's a powerful picture of forgiveness.
And one pastor talked about how that forgiveness wasn't just a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, a commitment to rebuilding trust and restoring harmony within the family.
Yeah, that's good.
And he connected that to the way we are called to live in community as believers, extending grace to each other, forgiving offenses, working towards reconciliation, even when it's hard.
Yeah, because we're not meant to do this alone.
Exactly. We need each other. We need to be able to confess our sins to each other, to pray for each other, to support each other through difficult times.
And to forgive.
Yes, to forgive, even when it's undeserved, just as Christ has forgiven us.
Because ultimately, forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past. It's about making space for a new future.
Exactly. A future that's marked by grace and healing and reconciliation.
And that's a message that I think resonates not just in the church, but outside the church as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
so relevant to our world today.
So much division and animosity.
Exactly. But Genesis 50:20 offers a different way, a better way.
The way of forgiveness.
Right, the radical transformative power of forgiveness.
It's interesting how much of the pit metaphor was used.
Yeah.
It really goes beyond just saying Joseph had a hard time.
It does. There's something about a pit, like the darkness, the isolation. It's a powerful image for those times when we feel trapped or even abandoned by God.
And a lot of the pastors use that image to show how we can change during those times of suffering.
Yeah, one pastor even said that those pits are like divine appointments sometimes.
Okay.
Not that God causes the pain, but he can use those times to help us grow and mature.
It's a tough concept for sure. But I remember one pastor compared it to a blacksmith forging a sword.
Oh, yeah.
Like the metal has to be heated and hammered and cooled over and over again. It's a rough process, but it creates a strong blade in the end.
It's a great way to show that God's work in our lives can be intense and painful, but it's how we become stronger and more resilient.
Right. And a lot of the pastors also said that God doesn't abandon us in the pit.
Right. It's often where we feel closest to him.
It's like when you take away everything we rely on, we have to face ourselves and we realize how much we need God.
And a lot of the sermons pointed out that the pit is what prepared Joseph to save Egypt from the famine.
Oh, that's right. He learned humility and resilience in the pit.
Exactly. It's a great reminder that God is using those experiences to prepare us for something, even if we don't know what it is yet.
It seems like all these pastors really tried to come up with unique illustrations for Genesis 50:20.
Yeah, they did. They used personal stories, pop culture, even history. It's amazing how they tied those things back to the verse.
Like the pastor who used Braveheart to talk about God's judgment. That was a great one.
Yeah, it was. It really makes you think.
I think it's important to be creative when we're communicating, especially with Bible passages that people have heard a lot.
Yeah, we need to help them see things in a new way.
And maybe take some risks.
Like the pastor who shared about his wife's illness.
That's tough to do. But it shows that he's human, just like everyone else.
Right. It reminds us that faith isn't about being perfect or pretending that life is easy. It's about trusting God even when things are hard.
That's a message that we all need to hear.
Yeah, we need to remind each other that we're not alone in our struggles and that God can use our pain for good.
So what's the one thing you hope people remember from all this?
I hope they remember that Genesis 50:20 isn't just a nice story. It's a reminder that God is in control. He is faithful, and he can bring good out of even the worst situations.
Yeah, we need to look for those but God moments in our own lives and trust that he's working even when we can't see it.
And we need to share that hope with others, encourage them, and point them to God.
So keep studying God's Word and keep trusting Him. He can make all things new.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.